Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Grand Rounds. My name is Joseph Caramelli. I oversee Grand Rounds for our department. A couple of points about the Grand Round series. First, I'd like to encourage you to write any comments or questions into the chat or the Q&A part of Zoom. I could keep track of these, and at the end, we'll go through these. Dr. Peel and I will go through these with Dr. Wills to post questions, comments. I'll acknowledge the Grand Rounds core team that works on Grand Rounds throughout the year, including Samhar Braha and Mike Walker. We do record and archive our presentations, and this year's series is funded through the Ripley Fund and the Garvey Institute for Brain Health Solutions. And I'll note that today's presentation is sponsored by the Center for Mental Health Policy and the Law. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll put a link in the chat that takes you to a 4 or 5 question brief evaluation of Grand Rounds, and that's helpful for me with evaluating Grand Rounds and communicating with speakers. I'll in just a moment or so, I'll turn it over to Dr. Peel to introduce today's speaker, but it's important for me to mention that today's Grand Rounds presentation is the Dr. Bruce Gage annual lecture in forensic psychiatry. Dr. Gage had worked as Chief of Psychiatry for the Washington State Department of Corrections and Director of Forensic Services at Western State Hospital and the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship Director. In fact, I mean, as I learned last year, Western State Hospital had renamed the Center of Forensic Services as the Bruce Gage Center of Forensic Science. And I believe many from Western State are attending today, and I welcome you to the Grand Rounds today. Now, I'm pleased to host this honorary lecture for Dr. Gage here in the Grand Round series, so we can include lectures that advance psychiatric care for individuals with mental illness and criminal justice system involvement. Now, with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Peel to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. As mentioned, this is a center-sponsored forensic Grand Rounds from the Center for Mental Health Policy and the Law, and we're delighted to host the Bruce Gage Annual Lecture in Forensic Mental Health, really to recognize Dr. Gage's work and carry forward his efforts to improve psychiatric care, education, and training in our state. And with this, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Cheryl Wills, who exemplifies the efforts of Dr. Gage. Dr. Wills is trained in general, child, and forensic psychiatry. She is the Chief of Psychiatry and Vice Chair for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Department of Behavioral Health at Metro Health System. She is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University. Her interests include community and correctional psychiatry. She has worked in several roles to improve mental health delivery for persons in corporal settings who are disproportionately racial and ethnic minorities. Among her many accomplishments, she has been active in organized medicine, including serving as a past chair of the American Psychiatric Association's Task Force on Structural Racism, and currently serving on the APA's Board of Trustees. I've had great pleasure knowing Dr. Wills for several years and have been so impressed with her dedication to psychiatry, education, and her advocacy. Her talk today will discuss the intersection of race, policing, and mental illness. She will discuss some of the emotional impacts of interactions between law enforcement and minoritized group members, and share insights in how organized medicine can inform strategies with law enforcement. With that, I turn it over to Dr. Wills for her talk on resynthesizing the nexus of mental health, law enforcement, and race.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Jennifer. I'm going to share my screen, but meanwhile, I'm going to say that I had the privilege of listening to Dr. Gage on numerous occasions and was enlightened by his thought processes and what he has to offer. And I still use a good amount of what I learned from him today. So, okay, let's see. We tested this before and it worked. And now it doesn't want to work. Hold on one sec. Maybe that's it. Okay, let me try one other thing.
Dr. Wills, I'll tell you, we do see your slide.
Do you see the whole slide, like slideshow, or?
It looks like a slideshow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess my view is different. Okay. As Jennifer said, I serve on the board of trustees of the American Psychiatric Association. Actually, we have a board meeting this afternoon, this weekend, so I'll be heading for that to go to DC after this. So anything you say and offer may be mentioned in the board meeting as a piece of constructive information from our members, because we are a member-based organization. So we're going to talk about resynthesizing the nexus of mental health crises and law enforcement and race. And when Jennifer asked me about the mental health and law enforcement issue, I'll say this like I said before, I said, okay, but that's boring. So while I was researching it, I thought, how can I make this more interesting? Even if it's just for me, because I like to think outside the box. And one of the things I came across as I was reading things, I said, wait a minute. The interventions for addressing equity and diversity and inclusion in healthcare are similar in many ways to what we can do, what law enforcement can do to improve how they perceive things and how they interact with others. Our objectives today will be, if I can, okay, there we go. Describe concerns about how law enforcement officials interact with people in mental health crisis. Examine the emotional effects of the interaction between law enforcement officials and minoritized group members, that is, members of minority groups who, when provided interventions, are not given adequate support. So basically, and the majority are destined to fail. Recognizing the commonalities between how law enforcement and healthcare professionals interact with members of minority groups, including individuals who have mental disorders. And that's very important because you have some overlap. And those of you who know about intersectionality, it's looking at the common ways in which characteristics which are often held by minority groups, including those who have mental disorders, especially those with serious mental disorders, overlap, interface, and affect the various aspects of their lives. And we're going to describe how organized medicine approaches to addressing racism can inform law enforcement strategy. The practice gap will be addressing the gap in knowledge of how intrinsic and extrinsic biases in medicine and law enforcement affect healthcare outcomes in members of minority groups, including people who have mental disorder. And I don't have any disclosures, but I do like to start lectures with this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes. I'm sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing past the first slide.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, it was that I had it on two monitors. I totally forgot about that. I apologize.
Okay. We're all set. Thank you.
Okay, previous slide. Okay, so I always like to start the conceptual talks that I give with the quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss people, events, and we're going to discuss some ideas today, a couple of events, and small minds discuss people. We're going to try to stay away from that because that's not going to bring us further to the goal of creating equity in healthcare law enforcement. Okay, so let's start with racism, which is a form of otherism, and intersectionality. The DSM-5 TR definition for race is that it's a social, not a biological construct that divides humanity into groups based on a variety of superficial physical traits, such as skin color, that have been falsely viewed as indicating attributes and capacities assumed to be inherent in the group. Racism is a system that assigns value and opportunities based on race, and otherism does the same as it relates to others, a system or practice of excluding others based on their status of not conforming to an acceptable norm. And I mentioned intersectionality, which is how all the aspects of one's otherism interface and affect their lives on many levels. Now, police officers take an oath and a bond, and this is from Washington State's police revised code. Any officer, before entering upon the performance of his or her duties, may be required to take an oath of affirmation that is blah, 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 conditioned on honest and faithful performance of their official duties. Honest and faithful performance of their official duties. And most law enforcement officers take this seriously, and even those who may fall short take this seriously most of the time. But when it goes bad, it's not a pleasant situation, especially if a life is lost. Now, one of the things I've learned about law enforcement is about the blue wall of silence, it should say. Now, we hear about that in terms of officers protecting each other, but I counted it profoundly when I was in New Orleans. I was living in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, and I went back to after they began to clear things up. And I had several friends who had family members, spouses, cousins, etc., who were law enforcement officers. Actually, all were male. And they needed psychiatry documentation to clear them for returning to duty. Every officer in New Orleans had to have clearance if they were out there in the field during the storm and thereafter. So when I would interview these people, and these are people I had dinner with, gone to barbecues with, played card games or table games with, so I knew them pretty well, gone to concerts with. When I would interview them, they clammed up. They would not say anything. So I would end up calling the wives, the spouses, the cousins, etc. And what they explained to me was the background information, which helped me engage the officers in opening up and telling me what was going on. But the thing that they were all afraid of was losing the commission. So in the federal system, it's a security clearance, but officers receive a commission to do their job. And without a commission, you're basically unemployed. So because of how mental health has been dealt with and has stigma and it's so pejorative in many environments, although it has been incrementally improving, not fast enough, police officers fear this, that others who see this or see them getting mental health care would say that there's something wrong with them and they're not fit for duty, so they won't be able to provide for their families, etc. Now, in the U.S. justice system, if we move from police work to incarceration, we know that U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, 639 per 100,000. There are almost 2 million if you count juveniles and adults. And interestingly, juvenile numbers have decreased. They're doing more residential and rehabilitative programming for juveniles, which was the reason that the juvenile justice system was set up, and the first juvenile court was opened in Chicago in 1899. Now, actually, they're beginning to get a little funding for that, because one of the reasons the system failed was because there was not adequate funding and oversight, no quality assurance or continued quality improvement, no credentialing, etc. Now, 2/3 of the women incarcerated have mental disorders, and roughly 1/3 of men, give or take 10%. Now, this is important and particularly related to the women, because if a child has a parent who is incarcerated for mental health concerns or otherwise, that child is more likely to be incarcerated, even if they're being raised by other family members or other people. So this has a significant impact. 3 out of 4 individuals with substance use, serious mental illness who are confined have a substance use disorder. And as we hear on the media, in the media all the time, the rate of Blacks is 5 times that of whites. So while Blacks comprise 13% of the U.S. population, they're substantially more likely to be incarcerated. And according to some research, up to 39% of Blacks being incarcerated is attributable to racial bias. Now, let's look briefly at police stop and frisk. And this is one of my peeves with juveniles. When these stop and frisk interventions were introduced or operationalized in New York City, more than 89%, that's like 9 out of 10 people they stopped were Black and or Latino. Now, was that because they were targeting those communities, or were there other factors? There are many different answers to this, and we'll never know the true extent of the mindset that went towards this, except for one thing. We do know that when police officers stopped stop individuals on the street, they got credit for it. So it's just like if we do RVUs, they had RVUs or quotas they had to meet or exceed to get recognition in whatever way the department said would be distributed. Now in Chicago, in 2014 to 15, minorities were stopped 4 times as often as what you saw in 2004 to 2012 in New York City. And in 2016 to 17, 71.8% were Black. Now, in terms of Cleveland, I put this here because in child psychiatry, I see this quite often, Black youth getting stopped for jaywalking. So if you or I walk across the street to our cars, we're less likely to be stopped. They're likely to be stopped, and it's sending a message to them. We're watching you. And I explain that to youth, and oftentimes they say that's not fair. Well, how are you going to change your behavior so that you can engage in self-preservation? Well, I'm not. They have no right to do that. And then we have to work through that. So that has an impact on emotional health on many levels. Why am I singled out? I'm born to lose. I'm destined to lose. They're going to lock me up anyway, so why bother? Now, give me 1 second because the Zoom is blocking my slide. Okay, disparities in emotional distress among adolescents who witnessing police stops. And this was in the Journal of Adolescent Health in last year. And one of the things they did was look at the fragile families and child well-being studies, and they looked at almost 1,500 teens who witnessed police stops. And what they found was multiracial, Black and Hispanic youth were more likely to experience emotional distress than were white youth. And Black and multiracial youth attributed this emotional stress to intrusive investigations and perceived injustices and distress during witness stops. And this is something that I talk with patients about often, and with colleagues. I have African American and Hispanic physician colleagues who routinely have been stopped. I mean, they're at the top of their field and they have been stopped bringing their families to dinner, et cetera, and their children have to see them getting out of the car, males much more than females, and having to deal with this. In a sense, a clear message to those children. Even though my dad or my mom is at the top of their game professionally, they're still Black. And I've often heard that from individuals who immigrate from Africa too. Several people have told me this. You know, I came here and I thought Black Americans were crazy about this racism and such, but about 2 years into living here, I experienced it. And each year I'm experiencing it more. So were they oblivious to it, or were they just fortunate not to have experienced it? Okay, so when we look at police interactions, Blacks and mental health, this is a meta-analysis. And basically we're estimating about 100 homicides by police per year. And as I said, Blacks make up 13% of the US population and 23% of firearms fatalities. And what these researchers, McLeod, Heller, Manzi, and Echeverria, determined was that prior police interactions almost double the prevalence of poor mental health. And on the right side of that slide, you see all of the different kinds of symptoms and disorders that people may have: the PTSD, anxiety, depression, up into and including suicide attempts. So this is a pretty serious matter. Now, when you had the defund the police situation, I remember President Obama said that he thought about it a different way because he had to look at all perspectives. And one of the things he said was his mother-in-law, Mrs. Robinson, would say that if someone stole her purse, she would want enough police around that she could get attention and get help for her situation. So it's not all black and white, it's complex. So here's a study looking at police contacts with and without people with and without serious mental illness. And one of the things they found, and looking back at all of these studies, is in terms of who calls the police. In mental health crises, it's often a relative or a friend. That is 41% of people who call would be relatives or friends. In terms of other issues relating police contacts and requests for assistance, it's about 12%. So that means that when you're getting a call for mental health crisis, you have a good chance that it's someone who knows the person and their history and may be able to provide more information. And then police-initiated contacts occur in about 19% of those with mental illness and 40%, 8% of them who don't. And self-referred is about 11%. So the person who has the mental disorder asks for help. Now, this is interesting because I work with the assertive community treatment team, and that is felons who are released on parole and they are ordered to have mental health services. So they have substance use concerns in most cases. They have serious mental illness, and we have a disproportionate number of sex offenders in the mix. And there's one person who is not a sex offender, but when I came in, they said, if you ever had to see somebody who the police are just out to get, he's the one. Even his probation officer said it. It's that bad. So I got to know the guy and the patient, and basically we talked about things, and he just felt things were helpless, that things weren't going to get better. And that was what the staff was saying too. So I talked with him about self-preservation, and he talked about, all of the murders in his community, that homicides in the community that you don't hear about on the news. And he's been in stores where there are robberies, and the police just pick him up for no particular reason. And he just sounded hopeless. And at that point, I said, I think maybe this has reached psychotic proportions. So what I did was I gave him a low dosage of antipsychotic medication, and we talked about him taking it because he had an adherence issue. And the next time he came, he was doing okay. He couldn't stand the police. He couldn't stand the fact that they harassed him, but he hadn't had any police encounters in 2 weeks, whereas he usually had a couple per week. And we started to build on that. And he actually decided that even though it was a tiny dose, he wanted to go on injectable medication because it was just such a relief not to be brought to the attention of police. So that's one case in which mental health could intervene to help this. And he had access to services. But as we know, many of the people who are in these types of situations do not. So when we look at homicides by police, the National Academy of Sciences says that it peaks, no surprise there, between 20 and 35 years of age. Black men have a 1 in 1,000 lifetime chance of being killed by the police. That is profound. I think about my Black male colleagues, my Black male neighbors, my Black male family members, and my friends' neighbors, etc. And of course, people who are incarcerated in mental health hospitals, and etc. And to have a 1 in 1,000 chance to be killed by police causes people in many cases, or in some cases, to change their lifestyle. I have friends and colleagues who won't go out after dark unless absolutely necessary, or when they go out, they make sure they have 1 or 2 women with them, etc., because they're scared. It's their reality, even though they didn't ask for it. They could be dressed in the nines, going to the department Christmas party and get pulled over. They could be going to a wedding, going to church, etc. Now, police kill unarmed Blacks at 3.5 times the rate of unarmed whites, based on Ross's study that was published in 2015. And other Blacks versus other racial and ethnic groups, the ratio was 2 to 1, according to Fagan and Campbell. Now, over 1 in 4 people, over 25% of police homicides victims have had serious mental illness, including psychosis spectrum disorders. And that's extremely important because it shows that that rate of being killed because you have mental illness is very high in Black men and other minorities. And the risk is, according to Boston Medical Center Psychiatry, is 16 times greater for Blacks with for people with serious mental illness. So you're 16 times more likely to be killed. So this is pretty serious matter. In terms of the vicarious traumatization, when they looked at a statewide emergency database, they found an 11% increase in emergency department visits per 100,000 in the population, related to depression and other symptoms. And basically what they found was that at 1 in 3 months, the numbers increased, but it was only African Americans. And it was, it was African Americans, and it was only restricted only in that community. In other words, where the community where the homicide had occurred, this data existed. But when you spread out beyond that, it wasn't there. So there's something about having a homicide by police in your immediate community that is a trigger for mental health for many people, or mental health, seeking mental health services for many people, because the numbers of people who are traumatized are likely much, much higher, but they're not seeking care for various reasons. Now, this is, I'm going to talk a little bit about structural barriers to judicial equity, because this is not limited to police interactions. This is a study by Calfell, Hancock, and what they did was they went to the Philadelphia court system and got court transcriptionists, and they got 8 native speakers of quote unquote African American English to record a pre-written statement. And they asked the 27 transcriptionists to transcribe them. And what they found was that in those transcriptions, the accuracy of sentences was 59%. The accuracy of words was 82.9%. And who, what, where, and when were often transcribed incorrectly. The sentences were correctly paraphrased only 1/3 of the time. So what does this mean? It means that there's a problem with how we transcribe, how the transcriptions go forth and their accuracy. So if a person is applying or trying to appeal their case, that transcript will be read and it's not accurate. But that also could extend to the jury. Are they misunderstanding what was said, or the judge? But what the court transcription has said is, we know it's a problem. We want help. We want coaching on this. But they had to get a 95% on the exam, transcriptionist exam, to be certified as transcription. So what is the discrepancy? Well, what they said was there are 2 things. A, when they were when they took the exam to be certified, the recordings were of judges, attorneys, and newscasters. So they don't represent how the average person in the community may communicate. The second thing was, when they're in transcription school, learning the craft, learning the skill, they are told that when something doesn't make sense or they are not sure of something, ask that it be repeated. But in the court system, it is quietly discouraged. So you can imagine how this can impact someone if they've said that, I think that they misunderstood me, or they said the opposite of what I said. And there was another case that I removed here for brevity, and it's called the lawyer dog case. Basically, we have an African-American man in New Orleans, and he's suspected of engaging in sexual offenses against 2 children. And he agrees to cooperate with interrogation, and he receives his Miranda rights, and he's okay with it. And then they invite him in again, and he realizes a second time he agrees to it, but he realizes that something is wrong. He realizes that he's going to incriminate himself. He's not feeling comfortable with this. So basically, he said something like, I see what you're doing, and this is not going to happen because, man, give me a lawyer, dog, because I'm not putting up with this. So when they did not give him a lawyer, they did not stop the interrogation, and they charged him. When he went to court, the attorney tried to get the testimony thrown out because it violated his Miranda rights. And the judge said no. So it went to the appellate court with review, and they said no too. But there was one judge who just had to write an opinion when it wasn't required. And basically he said, if someone's asking for a lawyer, dog, they're not asking for assistance of counsel. Now, that hit the newspapers, and if you look up Lawyer Dog, that case is there. There are pictures of attorneys' bodies with dogs' heads on them, etc. And one of the things that was key about this was that if you go into look in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the term dog, D-A-W-G, slang means friend, colleague, peer, etc. And that was in the dictionary at the time that this judge misinterpreted it. So how, and again, we wouldn't have known that that was the reason, or at least this judge's reason, had he not decided to contribute. And this judge also had some other issues where we had the Angola 5 and Angola prisons in Louisiana. And they, the attorneys and the defendants asked that he be recused from the cases because he had gone on talk radio and said they were all guilty. Expressing a personal opinion, so he could not be objective. So these are problems that we often don't see, but when they're published, we take notice. Well, police homicides and suicides among Black Americans are significant. The U.S. Census data show that in months with at least one killing of Black person by police, 0.472 additional suicides per 100,000 Black Americans occurred in the local community. So could that be the stress? That's the adverse experience impacting the community in different ways? Or could it be that people are acting out, or they're just traumatized, or that this is a breaking point? It's not clear, but we need to understand more about that. But better yet, let's kill, the police should kill fewer people of all types. And this association persisted even when controlling for gun ownership, but it was not related to white suicides or white killings and Black suicides, or white killings and white suicides. It was just Black on Black homicides, or Black killings and Black people with suicidal ideation or attempts. What about medicine? And here's where we go into the other side of this. There are many versions of the Hippocratic Oath, even some that are that were created in the last couple of years during the pandemic and civil unrest. But this is a classic version, and a part of a classic version that says, "I will willingly refrain from doing any injury or wrong from falsehood, whatever may be the rank of those who it may be my duty to cure." In other words, we are supposed to treat regardless of how someone looks, smells, dresses, speaks, etc. And too often those biases interfere with our ability to care for people. Part of that is conscious, such as I am not going to treat any people who are wearing blue t-shirts today. And part of that is unconscious. Doesn't come to immediate memory. For example, although Sarah says she's fair to all people, we notice that people with red t-shirts always end up at the back of the line when they're going into the concert and she's controlling the line. So let's go to the Principle of Medical Ethics by Beauchamp and Childress. And this was back in the 1970s, if I recall correctly, and we still use it today. Respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and that's the key one, and justice. And in the interest of furthering non-maleficence, things changed in 2020 during the pandemic, when more data about discrimination and inequitable health care, et cetera, came out. One of the things that people began to look at more in patients are experiences involving culture, trauma, and racism. As a matter of fact, I remember I commissioned a resource document on how to talk with patients about racism, and that can be found on the APA website. And actually the Geriatric Council is working on a variation of that, looking at Black history and how it impacts how we communicate with Blacks and what their perceptions are. So this is very important to understand, because while we're doing evaluations, including forensic evaluations, we're supposed to be objective and non-judgmental, but we have to get the information. So much in fact that in the last 8 years, 8 to 10 years, I have been putting a section at the beginning of my history before I go through symptom inventory, just called traumas, losses, and stressors. And I tell patients, you know, it's important for me to understand your story, but often trauma, losses, or stressors have a profound impact on what you tell me and how your life is and your experiences. And I want to understand that, and it helps me to know up front, if you don't mind, so that I can put the pieces together better. Now, I'm not talking about what traumas are, but your traumas, not your mother's traumas, not your child's traumas, not my traumas, but yours. What is real to you and on your terms? And you may feel free to tell me about these at any time. If you're not comfortable doing that today, that's okay too. And it's amazing with what I learned about people and how to put the puzzle together. And I believe it helps me formulate cases more effectively and actually refine the treatment and tailor it more to that patient's concerns. Now, in 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. said to the media, of all the forms of discrimination and inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman because it often results in physical death. And hopefully not many of you have seen that, but unfortunately I have. So when we look at the bias, we talked about what explicit and implicit bias is, and we know that it disenfranchises a class of people, the people who are discriminated against. It affects health and wealth disparities, and it affects morbidity and mortality. And the yellow slides, the portion of the slide here, shows the things that we're often dealing with in healthcare. Healthcare, nutrition services, how illnesses are defined, clinical trials, and in some cases who get submitted to a hospital. As a matter of fact, there was one case in about October 2019 that was in the newspapers, and it's basically the people in a hospital who handled the software, or the physicians, determined that there was a glitch in the software. When let's say you had congestive heart failure, they had an algorithm you use. All things being equal, if you were Black, you got sent home. If you were white, you got admitted. So when we use these software, we need to look at what's going on, make sure it's accurate. Only that could have been two letters or two signs or characters that change the outcome of that, maybe even one. But sometimes people's biases are there. Sometimes it's unintentional or implicit, but it's there, and we have to be cognizant of that because that was costing lives. Now, given that race is an extremely concerning issue, in May through November of 2020, which was the first year of the pandemic, the AMA took a position. Racism is a threat to public health. So we have to move back closer to truth and reconciliation. Race is not a biological determinant of health, and we knew that. It's distinct from ethnicity, genetic ancestry, or biology. So here's the part that really is the clincher. This is where they want medicine to move, and they are getting money to fund it over the years. They want us to focus on genetics and biology, the experience of racism, and social determinants of health, and not race when describing risk factors for disease. And when we see what's been going on lately in terms of medicine and some of the things that are changing, for example, how we calculate renal function in Black Americans has changed. The system has changed because at one point when it was traced back, it was a case of Ipsy-Dixit. Some doctors said, oh yeah, Blacks, we should use this factor because they're different, or their kidneys are different, or their muscular condition is different. But there was no evidence base for that. The same thing with certain types of liver disease in children. That was on the news a couple of days ago, where they're looking at, they changed the protocols. In terms of pain perception, that's another thing that's a problem. In terms of Blacks, they are often, even if they, even kids, if they rate pain at the same level, say they're in the unit, in the emergency department with appendicitis, the white child will get more medication or more pain meds than they will offer the Black child. Now, that sounds heinous. And one of the bittersweet parts of that may be that in terms of being not being generous with pain medicine, it may have saved a lot of Black lives in the opioid crisis, because if you recall, only recently have the numbers of Blacks been increasing at a substantial level. When this all started, we would see white patients in the early 2000s because they weren't giving Blacks that amount of medication. Okay, so let's talk about anti-Black racism in healthcare, because the AMA says we should look at the experience of racism and the social determinants of health. So how did this evolve? Well, in terms of implicit bias and explicit bias, people bring it into medical school. There was a study about pain perception in National Academies of Sciences, and Hoffman did this study and found that Blacks perceive pain have a higher tolerance for pain than whites, and that is what medical students disproportionately believed, without evidence for that. Okay, there's another study. So basically, people with these mindsets kind of gravitate towards each other, may have similar thought processes, etc. And then with residents, this was a really nice study done, published in JAMA Network Open, and they looked over 3,000 residents, white residents, and second and third year of residency. Second year tended to be more demanding because you didn't have the outpatient, you had the call inpatient, etc. Third year, less demanding. And what they found was they used the Maslow burnout inventory, and they also looked at bias. They used, I think, a 5-point bias scale. And what they found was the level of burnout, the more burned out the resident physician was, the greater likelihood that person would engage in anti-Black racism towards Black patients. So if you're burned out, you're going to discriminate against Black people. You may harass them, you may shortchange them, you may treat them as the outsider. And who wants to come back to healthcare when you're treated that way? So interestingly, what happened was in third year, the residents were less burned out, and the intentional bias against Black patients diminished. The implicit bias didn't budge. So even though when not burned out, they treated Black patients better, there was still a baseline of discrimination there, a bias against them. So we also know that the discrimination occurs in people who have limited against people who have limited English proficiency. It's not just race, and we've seen that in pediatrics too, in terms of the quality of care. Now, there were some studies about appendectomies, but a couple have come out in the last year, at least one that looked in the other way. So what they were saying was that Hispanic children whose parents had limited English proficiency were less likely to get as many radiological studies in an emergency room when they had appendicitis, and they were more likely to rupture before they went to the OR. So there's one study that shows that that isn't the case, but we need to look at that more closely, and it also would depend on how you use interpreters, etc. Now, the AMA talked about the experience of racism and the social determinants of health, how we live, work, play, worship, die, are born, are educated, what community resources we have, etc. And we know that with redlining, which means they discriminated against people who were Black and they couldn't buy property, as for example, with the GI Bill, Black veterans were eligible to buy property, but all of the property in Black neighborhoods, or a good proportion of it, was excluded from the GI Bill. But Blacks could not go into white neighborhoods where it was plausible, where it was possible to get a house that qualified. So that delayed communities in gaining health, acquiring wealth. So that puts people behind. As a matter of fact, 87% since 1619, 87% of the time that Blacks have been in the United States, it's been under the condition of of sanctioned discrimination, legalized discrimination. So, and when you think of it that way, the Blacks as a group are behind the 8 ball, not by choosing of their own, but by systemic or structural forces that they were not able to overcome because they evolve. Racism evolves over time. You had slavery, then Jim Crow, and then you had, right now we have all of the issues with drawing lines, regional lines to determine who can win an election, etc. So this is a concern, a systemic concern that one needs to be cognizant of because it may impact how you perceive patients who come into your practice. And the studies show that when social structural competence is taught in medical schools, it improves healthcare outcomes for the people who learned about it and the people who treat patients. If you've learned about it and you treat patients, you're more likely to have better outcomes with those patients. Okay, so in terms of social determinants, Swain, Hood, Januso, and Swain and Caitlin showed that out of all the things we do, only 17% of healthcare options are related to what is done in the office. So 16 to 17, a lot of people say 20%. So 80% of the healthcare outcomes depend on all of those things in the community that do not happen in that physician-patient encounter. Those social determinants of health, and that includes police violence, how your doctors treat you on the outside, how you can access services, insurance, where you live, whether there's green spaces, even climate change is being shown to affect minorities and poor people in poorer communities more harshly than in other communities. So let's talk about the experience of racism in psychiatry. Schwartz and Blankenship looked at studies regarding schizophrenia, and we know that there's a disproportionate number of Blacks and Hispanics diagnosed with schizophrenia. When you have the same amount of people in, when you have the same symptoms in 2 groups of people, minorities are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. That is even when semi-structured interviews are used. Same thing is seen in Black and white teens. And then we also know that antipsychotic prescriptions, the blacks are more likely to get worse, not worse, less novel first generation antipsychotics over other antipsychotics. And they are more likely, this came out in the past week, Blacks are more likely to be involuntarily hospitalized than whites. And in terms of over medication of Blacks, and especially Blacks who have been diagnosed with psychosis spectrum disorder, things like this ad on the right could have a role in it. This was from a 1974 issue of Archives of General Psychiatry. And we know the power that advertising has on how we think of things. So it says assaultive and belligerent, and you see an angry Black man. Cooperation often begins with haloperidol, a first choice for starting therapy. Well, that influences people who supervise people, and these things are passed from one generation of physicians to the next. We know that conduct disorder, personality disorders, etc., are more likely to be listed in the chart of a Black person than a white person. And Blacks are less likely to receive therapy after discharge, and fewer rehab options, and more likely to be restrained in emergency rooms and other settings. So what do they have in common? Both need to have healthcare and law need to have ways to mitigate the impact on minorities, and particularly Blacks, and more so Black males, especially as it relates to law enforcement. So training, accountability, and resources can be commonalities that are used. Number 1, becoming structural competent. And this was structural competence was formed, that the model, the thought process, etc., and it was coined by Jonathan Metzl of, I believe he's in Tennessee, and Helena Hansen, who's at UCLA. And basically, I mentioned that you're looking at how these policies, for example, the GI Bill, affects people downhill, and it's conducive to culturally competent care, evidence-based care, and as I said before, it can improve health outcomes. In terms of cultural competence, we have the DSM-5 cultural formulation interview, looking at cultures, norms, biases, etc. But there are shortcomings. This used to be in vogue. Cultural competence was the way to go. But the criticisms are that it's academic indeterminate. For example, I worked in Navajo on the Navajo Nation. I wanted to understand what the culture was like, so I practiced medicine there. I read a lot about the Navajo Nation in books and such before I went there because I wanted to understand. But if I had gone there and with the mindset, I know how you people are because I'm culturally competent, I read about you, that is going to be counterproductive. It risks cultural competence, risks overgeneralizing and stereotyping. But if I use that information strategically, then I can use it with cultural humility. Now, one of the things that people say is to do implicit bias training, and basically it's not as effective as we want. And implicit bias training has a lot of the cultural competence components in it. So what can we do? We can do structural competence, race-specific consonants in training curricula, looking at stigma surrounding mental disorders, including race in healthcare and law enforcement, looking at bias, looking at how stigma affects perceptions and decision-making in high-risk situations. That's for patients and citizens, because stigma does impact who gets restrained, who gets hospitalized, who gets shot, who gets arrested, and incorporating that into training so that people have experience with these types of cases before they go out to treat patients or before they go out in the community as law enforcement officers can make a huge difference, because it desensitizes the person and it's not the first experience that they have. But also looking at quality control. There was an officer, an Asian officer, who shot a Black person in a dark stairwell and killed him. One of the criticisms was that the officer didn't do CPR. Well, you know, one of the things that was there, they went to look at the police academy records and somebody did a line item veto and removed CPR training from the police academy curriculum. So in terms of quality control, that had a profound impact on the ability to potentially save lives. Looking at how stigma affects our perceptions and decision-making in high-risk situations, again, looking at how we think about people, sometimes getting a consult on the side or talking with someone to talk your feelings out or your thoughts out, or just saying, you know what, I need to punch out, or I need to tag out for a while. I just need a break. If you find yourself getting overwhelmed in that way and having these things, these concerns. Annual de-escalation trainings and safety techniques are recommended for healthcare and law enforcement. As a matter of fact, the studies show that 71% of pediatric residents do not receive any de-escalation or safety training, and they are in the emergency rooms sending us patients that they may have escalated unknowingly, and then we have to deal with it as psychiatrists. And also partnerships in behavioral health and law enforcement. And this has really helped a lot. The annual cross trainings, learning about mental health professionals, learning how police think, police learning about mental health information, and having systems for exchanging information. Okay, now here's the crux. I talked about structural competence, I talked about cultural competence, and I talked about the experience with Indigenous people. What I used my knowledge about or understanding about Indigenous people before going to Navajo Nation was to plan how I was going to conceptualize and formulate questions, exercising cultural humility. Critical self-reflection, looking at who I am, what I want to learn, how I want to go about it, and being respectful of the land that I was on and the cultures. Being open, answering their questions, being open to hear what they had to say, and non-judgment. I wasn't there to judge them. I was there to learn, and they were very responsive. As a matter of fact, they sent me to a sweat lodge, and then they had an intervention afterwards just to talk, and I learned more about their history, about the boarding schools, etc. So cultural humility has been shown to have benefits in treatment, such as strengthening the therapeutic alliance and improving health competence outcomes. And that leads to equitable care. And if you're have equitable care and you have better outcomes because you're less biased, you're also going to reduce burnout, and you're going to feel better about your ability to do things. So with that said, I think I'll stop here.
Dr. Wells, thank you very much. Here's a synthesis of multiple topics and direct applications to clinical care. I thank you for presenting today. I want to ask Dr. Peel for any comments as well.
I just really appreciate your thoughtful approach to this topic, really raising thought-provoking concepts for us and putting it together in a way that we really can understand. So thank you so much for all that you did in this grand
Thanks.
round.
I wish we had more time to talk. I'm sorry.
Wait, I think through your presentation, some of the questions that have come up, you just answered, through presenting, continuing to describe information. One, I recognize that we usually end right at one. I'll extend things just a bit to pose one question that maybe blends a few of the questions that came in about treatment, and not just, you gave a clinical example of an intervention with an antipsychotic medication and the outcome of interaction with arrest, in the immediate couple of weeks. Someone inquired about AOT, assisted outpatient treatment. Does it reduce criminal justice involvement?
Yes.
Broadly, are there other interventions that do reduce criminal justice involvement, like the case example you gave?
Peer support is a great intervention because you get people more to their appointments, you get them to commitments, and you have someone who's been there. And many places require you to have 4 years of stability. The only problem, what I learned actually yesterday at a meeting, was that peer support has a very high turnover rate. So they're looking at ways to address that and incentivize things, and also provide support for the peers, because even though they're they are exposed to a lot of things when they're dealing with individuals who have mental health concerns. In terms of assisted outpatient treatment and substance use disorder, I have patients coming in and saying, it's a miracle. It's changed my life. I'm going to see my daughter graduate for the first time. This is my first of 5 daughters that I'm actually going to be there for. So it does help. In terms of our program with the probation officers, they see it helping, and they will work with us to, I'm amazed at how flexible they are. They're not as willing to lock people up right away. Let's try that. Let's see what we can do, etc. Being sensitive to concerns like illiteracy. We have patients who don't want to do the program because they're going to be made fun of. When we have our supervisor, our group leader who runs this, he wants to know about it, and he will handle it in front of everybody, which shows that everybody's a human being. We all have strengths and weaknesses, but we can work with each other to build on things.
Well, thank you for that response, Dr. Wells. And I'll say, I think as much as we'd like to go through more, we do have to end for today's Grand Rounds presentations. I want to thank you again for this presentation, and thank you to Dr. Peel and to the Center for Mental Health Policy and the Law for sponsoring today's presentation. And
if you have questions, feel free to email me. It's CWills@metrohealth.org.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, and we'll end there. Take care.
Thanks. Have a good day.